Hey, what's going on, everyone? Justin here, and in this video, I want to go over some of my favorite history books of all time, I guess, that I've ever read. I've done several since I've started my booktube channel on my best of or favorite books on different historical eras and things like that. But I don't think I've ever actually done one just straight up of sort of all the history books I've ever read. And the part of the reason I haven't done that is because it's quite difficult, especially with history for me. Just I read so many history books, and there's a lot of good history books and even great history books that I've read, but I wouldn't necessarily ever call them my favorite. Plus, the way I kind of judge and like history books is different. Like some history books, I'm really satisfied even if the writing's terrible, but I just learn a lot. And then sometimes, if the writing's really good, but I don't learn much, it's not great, I guess, and vice versa. So, like I said, with my history books, it can kind of just be all over the place, but I try to kind of whittle it down to my five ish. I say ish, really good ones, I guess, at least of all my favorite list. If I had to make a list, if I really had to, and this is covering all the different eras I read about, and the reason it's going to be super skewed heavily towards ancient history. Well, actually, I take that back. Greek history, Roman history, and medieval histories, because even with my booktube channel, those are the three eras I read the most history about. And before booktube era, that was pretty much 100% of what I read. So yeah, that's kind of why they're just far and away. There's more of those than other eras. For example, though, there is no going to be ancient history on my list, and it's because after looking at all my ancient history books and trying to remember all the ancient history books I read, while there were some really good ones, obviously I think I just did a video on some of my favorite ancient history books. I don't think any of them actually would make it to the top tier level of all the history books I've ever read, and that's nothing against them or anything. It's just the way I just feel about them. I guess I don't know. This is gonna just be totally pointless and subjective, but let's just go ahead and get started. So we're gonna start with Greek history, and since I've started my booktube channel, I looked up all my Greek history books. I think there was 18 or 19 since I started the booktube channel, and there were a couple 5-star reads, but none of them were I would regret not reading that, I guess. So I'm going with one that I read quite a while ago, and probably no one's ever heard of it, but it's A History of the Greek City-State, 700 to 338 BC by Raphael Seeley. I think I just picked this up on a whim, when I first started getting really into history, because I wasn't always into history when I was younger. But the reason I'm putting this one on the list is it's quite academic per se. There's lots of notes and references and stuff, but it's cited really well. But the main thing is, with most history books that you get dealing with kind of surveys of the Greek world, or the history of ancient Greece or what have you, is largely they're histories of Athens, or histories of Athens with some Sparta. And that's essentially where 95% of the information comes from. And I don't know, I always get a weird feeling about that, because Athens and Sparta, first of all, they're basically polar opposites of each other. But more importantly, they're the two biggest anomalies of the Greek pole. Like they're the weirdest city states ever in ancient Greece. Athens obviously being literally the most direct democracy pretty much ever. Even more so than the United States by far and stuff. And then Sparta is the dual monarchy with the Hergian war system and stuff, which is just totally bizarre. And it's the only city state with a standing army. So both of them are way completely different from any other Greek polis, which is why I really enjoyed this book, because you get to learn tons about all different kinds of polises. Polises, I think it's poles. Always screw that, the plural of polis up. But anyways, you learn lots about Megara, you learn lots about Argos, you learn a ton about Corinth. I think you learn a little bit of Marseille and stuff. So it's really cool. It covers the entire kind of Greek world. You go, like I said, Marseille, which is essentially, well, I say Marseille is Massalia. I totally screwed that up. Anyways, Massalia, which is the ancient Greek version of Marseille, essentially. So you got the Western Mediterranean. Then you also got all the Anatolian cities Miletus and stuff are covered, and it's really cool because a lot of the archaeological evidence is uncovered, dealing with kind of different like trade systems and the pottery and what have you, stuff like that. So you deal a lot with individual city-states, but you also learn kind of like general overview stuff of kind of like the Greek world as well. So that's why I really like this book, just because it kind of gives a good overview of the entire breadth of many different city-states and how they kind of like differed and what was like kind of unique about each different one, but also what was similar. And it doesn't just focus on Sparta and Athens. So yeah, definitely give this one a look if that sounds appealing to you. I know I cleaned like some of my shelves off over there, so I have to like actually move stuff around. Oh, and for an honorable mention, I guess I gotta do a plug for my landmark histories. There's actually 4 or 5 of them now, but I have the landmark Herodotus, and the one that started it all was the landmark Thucydides, which is really cool. If you don't know what these are, you know what like a biblical commentary is, where like, you know, you have like the verses and stuff, and then you have like just people writing kind of like notes and comments about what it actually means or whatever. It's kind of the same idea, except you're dealing with like ancient sources. So obviously with the landmark Thucydides, you're dealing with Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. What's really cool is there's tons of maps, tons of references, like different definitions of like Greek terms and stuff. So I think it's really cool. There's appendices and things to help you just like understand the text better. So I think they're awesome, and they're all mostly on the actually I think they are all on the classical world. Thucydides, Herodotus, Appian, and Arrian. No, Xenophon and Arrian, and then I think Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars just came out. I say just came out, I think it's like a year ago. But they are working on Polybius, and I will be pre-ordering Polybius when they announce that. But anyways, so those are a Greek history favorite, even though I probably just rambled on for like 1,000 years. The Roman one was actually a little bit easier, just because I have kind of like a nostalgic one that I really, really enjoy, and it's The First Punic War by J.F. Lazenby, and this obviously is just kind of like just a treatise on the First Punic War. And I've read lots of Roman history books, but for whatever reason, after I read a bunch of surveys and stuff, the First Punic War kind of stuck out to me just because there's almost like nothing on it. I think at the time when this was published, I think in the mid-90s, it was the only book like in English on the First Punic War. And I think even like now, I think there's only like 3-ish kind of like focusing on the First Punic War. And that's kind of just interesting because the Second Punic War, I literally have like a whole shelf of Punic War stuff, but almost all of it is the Second Punic War with like Hannibal and Scipio and stuff. But what's interesting about the First Punic War, it is probably the longest continuous war, I guess, in the classical world. Lasted 23 years, and though the Peloponnesian War was technically a little bit longer, there was like a 10-year kind of piece like in the middle of it, whereas with the First Punic War, there was essentially no break at all between Rome and Carthage, mostly fighting over the territory and waters around Sicily. But also, just as an example, the First Punic War had probably the biggest naval battle in terms of actual people and manpower being involved with the battle at the Battle of Economus. And if you calculate it out and stuff, it's by far and away even larger than the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is the biggest battle involving people in World War II. So it's just kind of mind-boggling to see the scale of some of the stuff kind of going on with the First Punic War. And like I said, just not much is known about it. But anyways, the book is very well written. It's researched, obviously, quite thoroughly. There's lots of good references and stuff. There are some maps, not like as much as, of course, I say that, like, you completely missed pretty much all of them. But what I like about the author is he covers everything thoroughly. And he goes into, he uncovers like some stones, but he doesn't just like continually get lost in the weeds with some like academic books that are kind of like really specific. Like sometimes you can go on these like 10-15 page tangents that don't really mean anything. And while he does usually bring them up, he doesn't, like I said, he doesn't get lost in the weeds, but he will like uncover the stone for you to show you that, yes, there is like this textual problem, like we don't know whether to believe this person or this person because they're both viable, stuff like that. And since we're dealing with the First Punic War, he definitely uses the primary sources like a lot, and like critically like analyzes like each like source and kind of compares them and tries to explain like, you know, why we can believe like one source over another and stuff like that. And this was, like I said, one of the first Roman history books I read that wasn't after I read a couple kind of like general overviews of like the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire and stuff. So I think I have like kind of a nostalgic kind of like taste for this book, I guess. Plus, there was a time way back in the day where I had a website where I used to write history articles, and my first topic was like a 60 or 70 post long thing, I guess you'd call it, on the First Punic War. So you could just say I was kind of like obsessed with it for about like 6 months or something like that. All right, so now we go kind of into like medievalish era stuff. I got 2 books on that. This one I read, Summer of Blood, England's First Revolution by Dan Jones. Before I started booktube and stuff, Dan Jones is he's probably one of the most famous popular medieval historians around right now. He's written a book on like the Crusades, the Plantagenet, and obviously Summer of Blood. I think he has a couple others. I don't know if this one was published. He has one on Magna Carta and the Wars of the Roses. So he's covered like the majority of at least English medieval history anyways. But the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is the subject of this book, and this was the first book I read on it. I think since then I've read 2 or 3 others. I think I got, what do I got? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I got 4, so I've read 2 more since then. And the Peasants' Revolt is just like a really interesting little event, I guess, in history that I've always like really been fascinated with since I learned about it like in high school. Of course, once I learned about it in high school, there was probably like a 6 or 7 year gap in between me like picking this book up and reading or learning about it. But anyways, it's really like when the peasants got tired of taxes of a certain kind of like poll tax, I believe, and they actually went and did something about it, sacking the city of London, executing like the exchequer and stuff, and yeah, pretty crazy stuff. And like I said, it's kind of like swept under the rug, I think, a lot of the time, that people actually were able to rise up and almost get something accomplished. It didn't really amount to anything too much, but I think it's still an important thing to kind of study. And it's like I said, it's just kind of like one of my favorite time period. It's not really a time period. One of my favorite like little events in history, and I just really enjoyed the book, and it was the first one I read on it. So, and now this is kind of Dan Jones is kind of always like an author I kind of point people to if they want to get like started into like medieval history and everything. So yeah. All right, and then for some other medieval histories, we have some social histories. And Life in a Medieval City is by Joseph and Francis Guise is probably my favorite social history, which is like a history that deals with kind of like how a person actually lived in a certain time period, what they actually, ate and did, and how they worked, and what was their home life like, and stuff like that, especially for the common class, because a lot of history, historically has been about famous people, rich people, great people, politicians and generals and stuff, not really the everyday person. So I really enjoy books that kind of just demonstrate how a person actually lived, and obviously these ones are dealing with the medieval people period. And just like I have the Life in a Medieval Village, because there's also this one, and Life in a Medieval Castle. And just kind of like a plug for that, for people that like Game of Thrones. They have new, really nice, like looking reprint editions, because George R. R. Martin went out and said, I used these books for research on Song of Ice and Fire. And then I think enough people got interested in them all of a sudden, just because he said that or posted that somewhere or whatever, that they needed to do like a rerun of them. So there is that. But the reason I have the Village one, there's a quote I want to read real fast, just to kind of explain why I enjoy like these books so much. And obviously this is dealing with the medieval village. So the medieval village, in contrast, was the primary, fail. All right, I gotta get my narrator voice out. The medieval village, in contrast, was the primary community to which its people belonged for all of life's purposes. There they lived, there they labored, there they socialized, loved, married, brewed, and drank ale, sinned, went to church, paid fine, had children in and out of wedlock, borrowed and lent money, tools, and grain, quarreled and fought, and got sick and died. So it's literally like it's like history of people's lives and stuff. I just find that really fascinating. And Life in Medieval City, I think, is the best. Well, I've only read 2 out of the 3, but I think Life in Medieval City is definitely the better one. But just for example, the chapters kind of dealing with what we're talking about. We got a burgher's home, so that's like kind of like a pretty good middle class merchant. But a burgher's home, a medieval housewife, childbirth and children, weddings and funerals, small business, big business, the doctor, the church, the cathedral, schools and scholars, books and authors, the new theater, disasters, town government, and the fair. So it deals with lots of really cool, like I said, just really specific things about medieval people's lives. And my favorite ones out of this one was big business and small business, dealing with sort of small business, kind of dealing with like kind of within the household, or so like kind of with you know, how did one actually go about, you know, making leather, like tanning leather or blacksmithing and stuff like that. And then big business kind of dealing with kind of like the whole like guild system and stuff. So definitely like learned a lot. And like I said, I just really enjoy these kinds of books and encourage anyone who's kind of interested in researching the medieval world. Those are some books you definitely got to pick up. All right. And then for one more book, like I said, most of my books up to like Renaissance I read for history, and then it kind of like trails off really hard. But I've been trying to read definitely a lot more different kind of eras and topics since the Renaissance, I guess in the past like 2 years or so. But one other era that I've read quite a bit about is World War One. It's pretty much like the only modern thing I'm like really interested in. But by far and away, my favorite World War One book, and like just a great history book overall, is G.J. Myers' The Story of Our World Undone, The Story of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. And this obviously covers the entire course of the Great War, and you can see it is a pretty thick tome. I think it's the biggest one out of all the ones I have. I think it's like 700 pages. Yeah, it's about 700 pages plus like a ton of notes and stuff. But this book just does a really great job kind of introducing the whole context of World War One, kind of like the lead up to it, as well as kind of like a little bit of the aftermath and stuff, and then obviously each year in between. But he does cover most of the nations involved, so it's not just the Western Front. He deals a lot with kind of like the Eastern Front and stuff, as well as different theaters of operation in the Middle East. He has tons of vignettes on different profiles of different individuals and statesmen and politicians and stuff, and generals throughout the war. Not focused just only on the big name people that you hear in a lot of other books. Like I said, I've read probably about 20 other World War One books, and this is by far and away blows the other ones out of the water, especially since it's pretty much just like a survey overview of the entire history of World War One. And I think it's just really well written as well. It might not be though as gripping as like the best fantasy novels or whatever per se. I don't think nonfiction really, very rarely can do that, but like I said, it's still like a book you wouldn't want to put down, and I highly encourage anyone who's interested in World War One to pick up this book as well. All right, and if you made it this far, I'm gonna do a plug for the History Challenge Readathon. I think I forgot to mention that at the beginning. But anyways, that's a cool readathon that I'm co-hosting with several other cool people. I think it starts on August 17th, and I'm gonna leave a link down below to my announcement video and to the creator's announcement video as well, kind of just explaining what that is. And it's just a readathon event where everyone's going to get together and basically read history books, because I think the booktube community needed one. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments down below what your favorite history books of all time, no matter what kind of topic or era or anything that's actually dealing with. I'm always on the lookout for good history books. Don't forget to check out my Twitter, Instagram, and Etsy shop, all that kind of cool stuff. And thank you all for watching. Always remember, whether you're reading history or not, read victoriously.